I am 78 now. For 40 years, I hid the impossible in the woods behind my house, and I never told a soul until last week. On a cold night in October of 1985, I made a choice that altered every year after it. My name is Harold Miller. I was a carpenter then. I live on 25 acres outside of Ashland, Oregon, and what I kept changed the meaning of protection and truth for me. I could say this is a confession, but confession sounds like asking for forgiveness. I am telling what happened because enough time has passed and because someone else has forced my hand. This is a slow story of shock, of care, of secrecy, and finally of exposure. It is the story of how an ordinary man sheltered a living creature that everyone called myth, why I kept that secret for 4 decades, and what I did when a hunter found out. I will say the word Bigfoot because that is the name people use, but remember that this is about a life I swore to protect. I will tell the sensory details I remember so you can feel what I felt. I will tell the names of the people who helped and the mistakes I made. I will tell why I finally let the world in and what it cost. I do not come from nothing. I grew up in a small house in Medford, Oregon, son of a school teacher and a machinist. As a child, I learned how to fix things and to keep promises. At 13, I watched my father refuse to sell a piece of land to a developer because his father had planted an oak there. At 21, I learned to read maps and to sleep under the stars. My mother, Margaret, taught me to knit and to notice small things, like the way birds cocked their heads. I built my first shed at 17 and my first cabin at 30. I was never famous. I was never curious for glory. I liked solitude. I liked that the woods behind my property kept their own hours and their own voices. That isolation was not loneliness. It was a choice that made me able to keep what I would later keep. I worked as a carpenter. I taught my nephew Mark how to use a chisel, and I married Elaine for 12 years before we drifted apart without anger. My life had rhythm, a simple set of chores, a radio that never changed. When the storm came that night in 1985, I was at the edge of that rhythm. I did not know that the choice I made would keep me busy and sleepless for decades. It was October 12, 1985. I remember the date because the moon was thin and the rain sounded like glass on the roof. I was coming home from a late job in Ashland, my hands oily, my boots full of mud. The dogs had been barking earlier and then stopped as if someone had told them to be quiet. Around 11:30, I followed a sound that was not a sound I knew. At first, I thought it was an elk or a wounded deer, a cry that had human cadence but animal breath. I followed the sound to the creek behind the old mill. The wind smelled of wet cedar and gasoline from the old mill pumps. I stepped into a shallow cut in the earth, and there was a scent I could not place, a metallic, sweet odor like iron and pine sap. The thing I found was hunched in a tangle of roots, breathing fast, fur matted with dirt, one arm twisted. Its face, when it turned toward me, was not like an animal I could name. The eyes were the first thing I remember, brown but reflecting the moon, alert and fierce. The fingers had calluses and a scar that looked like it had been stitched once. It exhaled a sound that might have been a laugh or a groan. For a moment, I thought I was dreaming. I could have used my phone. I could have driven into town and called someone official. Instead, I took off my coat, wrapped it around its shoulder, and sat on the mud beside it. The decision was absurd and immediate. I did not even remove my boots. I felt the warmth of its breath, and I knew then that it was terrified and in pain. It reached for me with a hand the size of a dinner plate and held my wrist like it knew me. That hold was what made me promise with every bone in my body that I would not let anyone take it away. I called the neighbor, Tom Hargrove, and I spoke in a voice I did not recognize, low and urgent. Tom was a hunter, and he had a truck with a bed big enough for a small horse. He arrived with a flashlight and a flask and said, "Harold, what is it?" I said, "Get down here." He saw the creature before I could explain, and he swore softly. We lifted it together. Its arms were heavy like tree limbs, and its skin under the fur was warm and surprisingly soft. Tom said, "Do we call someone?" I looked at the road, at the lights dim in the valley, at the idea of men with guns and men with clipboards. I said, "Not tonight. Put it in my truck." We wrapped it in tarps. At the truck, the creature reached up and pressed its palm to my cheek. It smelled like earth and rain. That touch sealed it. We drove it to my barn. In the barn, the smell of hay mixed with the smell of the creature and something else, like old tobacco. I took off my shirt and used it to press a bloody arm stump. Tom said, "This is bad." I said, "I know. I do not have the language then to say the truth. I only had the choice to protect or to reveal." The barn smelled of oil and cedar, and the animals' frightened breath. We worked through the night. We made a crude splint of scrap wood. Tom boiled water, and I found an old first aid kit with bandages and whiskey-soaked rags. The creature watched with those deep eyes and made small sounds that sounded like syllables. Once, very quietly, it said something that sounded like a name. I wrote it down on a scrap of paper. The name looked like a pattern, not a human name. I would keep that paper folded in my wallet for years. I did not call the sheriff. I considered calling Dr. Patel, a veterinarian in Medford who treated farm animals and called things by Latin names. Instead, I stained the barn loft with blankets, I closed the shutters, and I fed the creature warm broth. I did things a man who had worked with his hands could do. I cleaned wounds. I sewed a torn flap of skin as best I could using a needle and thread. I made a cradle that could hold its weight. I remember the sound of the needle passing through skin, the small pluck it made, the smell of disinfectant that burned my nostrils. The creature looked at the stitches like it had felt sutures before. It trusted me in a way that was both animal and more. My hands smelled of antiseptic and wood shavings. That night, I promised silently to keep the secret. I made a list of supplies I would need. I named the creature in my head because giving a name felt like making it mine and making it safe. I called it Sam for lack of anything better. I fed Sam with a ladle and held the ladle to his lips as if he were a child. He responded with a wet, grateful noise and closed his eyes. Tom left at dawn with his truck. He looked at me and said, "Are you sure about this?" I said, "I am." He did not ask questions. He left nails and rope and said, "Call me if you need me." I did not call him again for a year. Over the next few weeks, I improvised care. I learned fast. When Sam developed a fever, I used cool packs wrapped in towels. I chopped willow leaves that made a bitter brew and helped reduce swelling. I built a shelter in the lower portion of the barn with insulation and straw. I learned his sounds and what they meant. We developed a crude communication. I began to leave cards with symbols and drawings on a little board. He would point, nod, tilt his head, and sometimes he would draw a line in the sawdust. I recorded these interactions with a tape recorder I kept in the loft. I wrote down the patterns, the cadence, the way he would draw circles when he was confused, and straight lines when he wanted to show direction. He slept by my feet, and when he woke, he would pat my hand like a child asking for permission. Over time, I realized he was not only intelligent but watchful. He learned routines. He learned the sound of the truck and the difference between Tom's boots and mine. He learned the names of the birds outside. He would mimic whistling if I whistled. His backstory I can only guess, but sometimes he would hum a low tune that sounded like the valley itself. He had scars on his arms that hinted at narrow escapes, and once I found a small pendant caught in his fur that looked like it had been carved by a hand familiar with tools. I could not tell where he came from. The choice to name him and feed him felt less and less like theft and more like stewardship. In the first year, I named some allies. Tom remained my right hand. My nephew Mark helped move straw bales and learned to be silent around Sam. Dr. Patel once came to help after I convinced him Sam was some sort of exotic primate that had wandered in and broken a limb. Sarah Ames, a nurse I had known since church, came once to help with fever management and brought herbal tinctures that calmed nerves. Luis Ortega, a retired biologist who lived 2 towns over, met me when I was desperate for a second opinion. He was emphatic that we not publicize anything until we had more information. Officer Harris, a sheriff deputy who owed me a favor after I helped patch his barn roof, agreed to look the other way when strange sounds came from my property. Elaine, my former wife, brought casseroles that Sam sniffed and then refused. Over the decades, I would add names like Dr. Patel's assistant Maria and an old ranger named Don who knew patterns of hikers and hunters. Each person I trusted risked their reputation to help. Each person asked me the same question in different ways. Why hide it? I answered differently each time. Sometimes I said, because the world is not kind. Sometimes I said, because it would become a circus. Sometimes I said, because he is alive and deserves dignity. Those reasons felt true each time. We built infrastructure. I bought adjacent plots of land bit by bit. I planted trees to create visual cover. I reinforced the barn foundation. I dug a shallow cavity under a false floor where Sam could move without being seen from the road. I constructed a feeding system that looked from the outside like a compost chute, but from the inside was a careful mechanism of pulleys so I could deliver food without exposing him to sight. I documented everything in a leather-bound ledger marked confidential. I kept food caches in sealed bins and created routes. So if I left in the morning for work, I could not be seen. There were risks. Once lumber workers came to the far edge of my property looking for lost equipment. Sam heard their machines and balled up in a corner, trembling. I created alarms that were simple and effective. A string across the path would jiggle a tin can. A mirror set at an angle would toss a beam of light if cars passed the lane. I improved ventilation in the shelter, sealed possible infection points, and kept a small first aid supply in a locked chest. I learned how to fashion a splint from copper wire and a leather strap. In the long run, we became clandestine but not cruel. My mission was to protect life. Communication deepened slowly. I taught Sam a system of cards with symbols for food, water, pain, go outside, come here, and stop. He learned to hold up 2 fingers for food and to clap softly when he wanted me to come. We would spend hours making shapes in the sawdust. I taught him the names of small things. He would repeat a word sometimes, the way children do, and sometimes he would refuse to say a name that seemed to hurt him. The affection between us was uncomplicated. He would lean his head on my chest and sigh. He would offer me a small piece of carved wood he had made in the months when his mind was quiet. When Mark came to visit as a boy, Sam would hide behind the support beam and peek out. Then he would show the boy how to tie knots. If I had to pick a moment that explained why I kept him, it was when Sam sat up through the night and held my hand while I was recovering from pneumonia one winter. He pressed his forehead against mine and hummed a sound that made my chest unclench. There was a dignity in those nights that made secrecy feel like an act of mercy. As the years became decades, the routine became a kind of work and a kind of love. I told myself it was duty. I accumulated more people to help with logistics. Dr. Patel would bring antibiotics when infections flared. Lewis would advise on foraging and nutrients. Officer Harris kept eyes on suspicious traffic. Mark grew into a man who worked on small engines and learned to make a water pump that quietly circulated ponds without drawing attention. Sarah checked our logs and made sure we rotated food to avoid spoilage. Each person had a role, and each role kept the secret safe for a time. Names I mentioned earlier reappeared, and others, like Rachel, who taught Sam to sort colors, and Don, who built a ladder of rope, were added to the ledger. When a wildfire came close in 1999, it was a team effort. We hauled water, we dug trenches, and we covered the loft with a tarp. soaked in water. Once smoke filled the valley, Sam stood at the barn door and looked at the sky like someone mourning. Those decades were full of small victories and small terrors. We learned how to tune the generator so it would not attract attention, how to disguise tracks, how to make fake paperwork for deliveries that would otherwise blow suspicion onto us. There were many nights I lay awake calculating risk and listening for the sound of hunting boots. Tension arrived in sharp incidents. The first true close call came in the spring of 1996. A backcountry hunter named Roy Finch set up a blind 2 ridgelines over from my property. Roy was known to shoot first and ask questions never. One afternoon, he followed a set of prints down toward the creek. I saw the smoke from his campfire from my roof. I called Tom and whispered, "Roy is moving." Tom brought a decoy of furs and set it on a false trail so that Roy would find tracks that led away. They did not know then how to read those tracks the way Luis taught us. Roy found the decoy and joked about a monster he had almost seen. He laughed, but he did not leave. The hunter returned over a week, and I found a boot print on my compost pile. That night I sat with Sam and I told him, "We have to be quieter." He understood, and he slept with a hand on my wrist like a child. I felt a raw fear that kept me awake for days. The second major close call was in 2007 when a young reporter named Jessica came to town following rumors. She camped near the old mill and asked questions at the diner. Luis intercepted her and gave her an interview about conservation and left it at that. But the pattern was now in motion. People heard fragments and stitched them into a tale. Each stitch increased the risk of discovery. The rules I lived by bent under pressure. I added more layers of deception to protect him and to slow the world down. There were moments of moral exhaustion. I recall lying in bed one night in 2014 and thinking, how long can I hold this? I was older. My knees hurt. Sam had aged too. His hair went thin at the temples and his breathing got louder. I began to document more deliberately. I made copies of my ledger and hid them in different places. I asked Mark to learn the exact pattern of my locks. I recorded conversations and hid them on old cassette tapes. One entry I kept said simply, "If I die, do not tell." Another said, "If I die, tell slowly." These contradictory notes were the map of my conflicted heart. I understood the value of scientific documentation and the cruelty that can arise when curiosity becomes exploitation. I leaned into secrecy because I believed it would keep him safe. But I also feared that secrecy could be cruelty by preventing research that could help him or his kind. Disease came in a way I had dreaded. In the winter of 2019, Sam caught a respiratory infection that would not lift. He coughed at night, and the sound wrenched my chest. I called Dr. Patel in urgency, and he arrived with a set of instruments and a face that looked older than him. After taking samples and listening, he said, "Harold, this is bad." He explained in clinical terms that the infection resembled a mycoplasma, like those found in wild primates, and could cross species lines if untreated. I had to make a choice that felt like giving up a child. We could admit him under official care and risk him being analyzed and caged, or worse, or we could try a treatment at home. We tried both. I gave Sam prescribed antibiotics for a month in carefully measured doses. We nebulized saline to loosen mucus. We kept him hydrated. The procedure for sample collection and PCR analysis was as follows. A swab was taken from the nasal cavity using sterile technique, stored in a viral transport medium, and kept chilled until a laboratory could run PCR to detect specific sequences. Results can identify pathogens and guide therapy. That is the technical way to say we were trying to be scientific while being secretive. The idea of sending his DNA to a lab made my hands sweat. What would they do with that information? Could it lead to protection or to a hunt? My health began to fail in ways I had tried to ignore. I had a heart issue in early 2023, and the doctor told me I needed to reduce stress and avoid heavy work. The irony was bitter. How could I reduce stress when the secret I kept was a weight in my chest? I began to think about legacy. If I were to die, who would care for Sam? Mark was grown and lived 2 hours away. Tom was older and had grandchildren. Dr. Patel had retired. Luis had become frailer. I prepared a plan. I made a legal will that contained a codicil about caring for the creature that I could not name in public documents. I hid copies of instructions in the locked chest, and I recorded a video message for Mark to watch only if I were incapacitated. I labeled jars with confidential notes about diet and behavior. I left the leather ledger with a note saying, "Follow the marks." It was a strange estate to manage. It felt more like a mission than an inheritance. I argued with myself about whether documentation was a betrayal. When I consulted with Rachel and with Sarah, they insisted some form of formal record was necessary to prevent exploitation if the secret broke. Eventually, I agreed to a middle path. I would keep physical objects and anonymized data in sealed envelopes to be opened only by a named trustee who would swear to protect Sam. The moment that forced my hand arrived, not with a federal agent, but with a man named Roy Finch, who I thought had left us alone. On a clear morning in September of 2024, Roy spotted a footprint near the edge of my property and posted about it on an online hunting forum. The post had a small photo and a caption that said, "Weird print near Miller Place." People began to pry. A local hunter by the name of Kevin, who I had not met, posted that he intended to hunt the area. Then, 2 weeks later, a young hunter named Daniel, eager and arrogant, came down my drive with a rifle strapped and a map he believed led to treasure. He had been given an anonymous tip. He was not a bad man, but he was fast in his thinking and slower in his caution. He came alone and in daylight. I saw him from my porch and I watched him approach the old mill. I felt my knees go cold. Sam was older. He could not move like he once did. I called Mark and I told him, "Stay away from the valley today." Mark did not ask why. He trusted me. I stared at the road and thought of the ledger and of my instructions. At 2 in the afternoon, Daniel crossed the creek and moved toward the barn. He had a binocular and he was singing under his breath. I could see his chest rise with each step. When Daniel entered the property, he surprised Sam, who had been leaning at the loft window watching with a stick in his hand. Sam moved like a bear, slow and then fast. He came down the ladder and then paused at the doorway. Daniel was between him and the open light. For a heartbeat, I felt everything collapse. I ran outside, my heart slamming. I shouted in a voice I had not used since I was a boy and ran to the door. Daniel spun and his finger was a heartbeat away from the trigger. I did not think. I ran and put my body between them. My shoulder took the weight of something heavy and the smell of fur filled my nose. Sam lashed out. He did not hurt Daniel, but he knocked him into the mud. I grabbed Daniel's arm and said, "Put the gun down." I was shaking. He pointed the rifle at me and said, "Get back." I said, "I will die for what is here, but I will not let you kill it." That is when Roy arrived, not because he was hunting, but because Tom had called him. Roy stepped in and said, "Harold, what is going on here?" I do not remember much of the next minutes. There were words and there were tears. Daniel began to understand that what he had come for was not an animal to be shot. He lowered the gun, and his voice cracked. He said, "I thought it was a story. I did not know." I said, "Neither did I once." That exchange was the hinge. It could have gone another way. It did not. After that day, the secret could not stay secret. Photos leaked. Social media did what social media does, and the story gained momentum. I had to make a choice about disclosure and documentation. I called Luis and Dr. Patel and told them we had a responsibility to choose how to present Sam. We drafted a plan that balanced science and protection. We would contact a trusted advocate at a conservation NGO and a legal advisor. We would not invite a circus. We set conditions. We agreed to a limited team who would examine Sam and ensure his welfare while protecting his identity and location. I arranged for anonymized samples to be taken and for a secure chain of custody. The first public revelation was strategic. We had to control the narrative to keep Sam safe. We issued a statement saying that an unusual primate-like specimen had been found and that it required protection. We asked for confidentiality while we developed a safe protocol. The press smelled a miracle and a controversy. There were calls from agencies and from men in suits. Some wanted access, and some wanted custody. Some wanted to study, and some wanted to cage. The moral questions we had debated for decades now fell into law and into committees. The public reaction was immediate and loud. Some people called me a hero. Some called me a villain. The hunters felt betrayed, and some conservationists praised the delay. Politicians wanted hearings. The media wanted sensation. I met with a panel of ethics advisors who argued that the creature deserved protection under endangered species guidelines even if its classification was uncertain. I signed legal protections that restricted access to the land and criminalized hunting near the site. The arrangement we made was imperfect, but it bought Sam time. We organized a carefully monitored examination by a small team of trusted scientists who agreed to anonymize any DNA sequences and to store samples in a neutral archive accessible only under strict conditions. There were protests, there were petitions, and there were late-night TV debates. Someone wrote an op-ed that called me willful and selfish. Someone else wrote that I had done the only humane thing. The world was loud and confused. The epilogue of this tale has 3 parts, and I will be precise, because the record matters. 1 month after the public reveal, there was an immediate surge of attention. The area was cordoned off, and Sam was moved to a secure sanctuary that resembled the barn, but with better ventilation and veterinary supervision. He was sedated briefly for an assessment, and he woke to a smell of clean water and unfamiliar hands. He looked at me with eyes that seemed both weary and relieved. Sat beside him, and he curled a hand into mine. I watched as a small team led by Luis and Dr. Patel took samples and then resealed everything. We had a careful protocol for sampling chain of custody that was designed to prevent leaks. Advocacy groups helped establish legal protection after public pressure. The local community was divided but calmer. There were talks about scientific papers that would not publish identifying information. Sam did not seem to understand the internet, but he noticed the quiet of the night returned because people respected the rules we set. 3 months later, the scientific work had progressed. The anonymized DNA did not match any known database completely. The results suggested a lineage related to great apes, but with unique markers, and a set of mitochondrial sequences that hinted at a long, isolated population. The papers were drafted in cautious language. We arranged for peer review under confidentiality agreements. Sam had adapted to the sanctuary atmosphere. He moved with more ease. The staff established a daily routine for him with enrichment tasks and exercises that matched what he had done for years in the barn. He made a slow bond with a caregiver named Maria, who would bring him woven toys and leave small cards with shapes. Communication improved, and Sam would now point to a board with symbols with more clarity. The community had begun to mobilize for protective legislation, and a small foundation was formed to support long-term care. My health was monitored, and I was treated. My heart improved. The journalists who had been aggressive eventually wrote follow-up pieces that acknowledged the ethical complexity. 6 months on, the situation was more stable, but no less complicated. Sam had become an instrument for a conversation about human responsibility. There were legal frameworks being tested and calls for a national task force. Some factions wanted to capture more of his kind if they existed. I spoke at a small confidential hearing and said plainly, "If you seek to replicate this discovery as a trophy, you fail the test of compassion." We worked to create a sanctuary model that could be replicated for other unknown species found in human borders. I donated my ledger to the foundation under trust that it would be used only to improve care and to inform ethics training for field researchers. Sam began to respond to music and would hum along when Mark played his old harmonica. In private moments, he would present me with small carved pieces he made from scrap wood and put them in my pocket like gifts. Those silent exchanges were their own reward. The public conversation matured into legislation that made it illegal to exploit unknown large mammals found in the wild without a plan for their welfare. I know some of you will ask, why did you wait so long to tell anyone? Why hide at all? Those are fair questions. I will not excuse every choice I made. I made mistakes. I withheld data that might have allowed a more scientific approach early on. I made decisions out of fear and love. I tried to shield a life from a world that can be both curious and cruel. The moral calculus is not simple. I protected a being that needed care, and I delayed knowledge that could have helped its kind. I can only say that I tried to weigh the value of dignity against the rush of discovery. In the end, I sided with dignity. If you were in my place, what would you have done? I know it is hard to answer. For the sake of the conversation, I want to hear your voice. Write in the comments, "EU protect" if you think an injured being should be sheltered before the science. Or write "EU reveal" if you think immediate disclosure is the only ethical path. Tell us in one sentence why you chose that. Your answer matters because it helps inform how society will act next time something impossible appears at our doorstep. We must decide together what dignity means when a living thing that does not fit our categories asks for help. Your choice will help others see how ordinary people can face impossible moral choices. I have tried to live by a few clear rules in these years. Do no harm. Keep careful records even if you are not ready to share them. Choose allies who will put welfare before fame. The file I handed over to the foundation includes dietary notes, the cards we used for communication, the ledger of visits, and a sealed envelope with DNA samples accessible only by court order under strict conditions. I asked that Sam never be placed in a zoo as a spectacle. I asked that research be done with the priority of cure and care, not curiosity alone. I do not end this with arrogance or regret alone. I end with a small act of closure. In a quiet ceremony, I placed a small carved figure of a man and an animal in the local museum in a locked case after obtaining permission with conditions that the exhibit would teach compassion and ethics. I told the curators, "This is not a trophy, it is a lesson." Some friendships require silence and some require speaking. I chose both at different times. If you ask me what shocked me about the hunter, finding out it was not his discovery. It was how quickly the world wanted to wear the truth like a badge. I am glad we slowed the rush. Some friendships cost dearly. Some secrets protect what is worth protecting. I hid a living Bigfoot for 40 years because I believed doing so gave that life its best chance. When the hunter found out, I did not shoot him. I protected the creature from him, and I protected the hunter from his own haste. That choice has left me with scars, and with small carved gifts, and with a ledger that smells like sawdust and disinfectant. If there is a single line I want you to remember, it is this: some lives deserve dignity more than they deserve fame. If this story moves you, subscribe to hear more accounts of difficult choices and of ordinary people who chose care over spectacle. Ask yourselves not who was right and who was wrong, but how we can build rules that keep both curiosity and compassion alive.